Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and this is pretty early in the morning for me, but the jet lag's working in the right direction, so that's a good thing. Okay, thank you very much, Mo, for that introduction and for bringing me along. It's a great pleasure. I'm looking forward to learning a lot. I'm not going to talk much about mindfulness or meditation today, but I've been increasingly engaged and interacting with this community, and I find that's huge potential and a huge amount to learn. And I think as you'll discover, the work that I've been involved in trying to understand consciousness from a neuroscience perspective actually has a long tradition, history of engagement with people in the meditative sciences and in mindfulness. And hopefully you'll see some connections too. But let's start kind of with just an observation about what it is to have experiences. So just think, you open your eyes and a world appears. Maybe not a world like this here in Washington in November, but you open your eyes and a world appears. And this seems like the most natural thing ever. No effort is required. It seems as though all our senses are windows onto this beautiful world full of colors and objects and shapes and people and places. And it really seems that there's this world full of stuff out there, stuff that has these properties like colors and shapes and so on. And then there's the experience of being a self, the experience of being you or being me. You don't even have to open your eyes for this. It just happens. The experience of being a self is always there in the background. No conscious effort is required at all. And this all seems pretty obvious, right? There's a world out there full of stuff that we detect through our senses, and it's the self that's doing the detection of the stuff out there in the world, and that allows us to form perceptions of what's out there in the world. We take in information, form perceptions of what's out there in the world. That's how things seem. But how things seem, of course, quite frequently is a very poor guide to how they actually are. And we've been here before. I mean, the history of science is, if you like, a repeated discovery of the difference between how things seem and how things are. We can go back, I like to go back to Copernicus. It seems like we're at the center of the universe. It's nice to think that. Humans always like to think they're at the center of everything, on top of everything. We're at the center of the universe, but we aren't. How things seem is not how they are. We're in fact on a tiny blue dot suspended in the abyss somewhere in the distant arm of some galaxy, somewhere on the fringes, which is what it feels like being English at the moment, actually. And the same goes for this view of how we perceive and experience the world around us. And the idea I want to share with you today is that our conscious experiences, whether they are of the world around us or whether they are of ourselves within this world, are kinds of controlled hallucination. They are neuronal fantasies that are reined in by sensory signals coming from the world and the body. And they're active constructions rather than just a passive readout of what's going on. And I think this idea is important from a number of perspectives. I think maybe for us together, it's important because when you realize the constructed nature of perception of self and world, it gives you kind of autonomy in the way you encounter your experiences of the world and the self, and of how you interact with your own self and with other people as well. So let's start with the world around us and with just perception of what's out there. And let's start even simpler, and let's just think about vision. We're very visual creatures. We tend to interpret our world, primarily the outside world, through vision. Now, your eyes open your brains to the visual world, but your eyes are only sensitive to a tiny slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. And probably you noticed that there's this tiny range called the visible range, which is highlighted in this picture. That's the entire universe of visual experience that we have is constructed from this thin slice of reality. This thin slice of reality is where we live. And even within this tiny range, things can depart, what we experience can depart very dramatically from what's out there. Now, this is always a challenge because I never try this out in advance. But I want you to have a look at one or other of these screens here, depending on which side of the room you're on, obviously, and just focus your eyes on the black cross in the middle of the screen. Try not to blink, try not to move your eyes around. And sorry for you guys in the middle, it's a bit of a pain, but I'm sure you can manage. And just raise your hand if at any point you start to see a green disc moving around. That looks like pretty much everybody. Anybody not see the green disc? I think that's amazing. Usually somebody doesn't. One person, thank God for you. That's great. Otherwise it doesn't work. I suspect you're lying if everybody agrees. Now blink and move your eyes around and you'll see the green disc goes away. So how many people have seen this before, by the way? A few of you. Okay, this is called the lilac chaser. I love it because it's it's an illusion, but the larger point is everything's an illusion. But this is a particularly good example of how our experience can depart from the sensory information we're getting. There are actually three things going on here. There's no green disc. That's the first thing to point out. There is no green disc going around. What's happening is there's a sequence of magenta patches that are disappearing one after the other. And this actually brings together three different effects that vision scientists have known about for a long time. One of them is called Troxler fading. So each of those patches has a very indistinct boundary. And when that's in the periphery of your vision, which is just doesn't have to be very far from where you're focusing, things with an indistinct boundary tend to disappear and get filled in by what's around them. The second thing that's going on is apparent motion. So when things appear and disappear, spatially close to one another, we tend to infer motion between them. This is, of course, how cinema works. We see discrete frames, but we perceive motion, even though nothing is actually moving. And the third thing that's going on is color opponency. So when your brain is exposed to a particular color for a while, and then that color disappears, we tend to perceive the opposite in color space. And the opposite of magenta in color space is green. Now, there's actually a fourth thing going on here, which is kind of funny, which is that I already told you that colors don't really exist in the world, that what the brain makes out of colorless electromagnetic radiation. Magenta exists even less than other colors. And the reason for that is if you have something that's magenta, you make it by mixing red and blue light together. Now, in the electromagnetic spectrum, if I just go back here, if I can, it's a bit hard to see, but red and blue are at the ends and green is in the middle. So if the brain encounters a mixture of red and blue light, it's expecting to have that middle wavelength as well. That's just the way things normally work. But it doesn't get it, so it invents something, and what it invents is magenta. So magenta is what the brain invents when it's expecting green but doesn't get it, and so the green that you're seeing here is not magenta. Is that clear? Okay, good. So how do we understand this? The idea behind all of these things is that the brain is a prediction machine, that what you see, what you hear, what you feel is nothing more than the brain's best guess of the colorless, soundless, odorless causes of its sensory inputs. So to get a handle on this idea, I want you to just do a little exercise of imagination. Now imagine that you are your brain. Imagine that you're a brain. There you are, you're sitting inside the bony vault of a skull. Now it's dark in there, it's silent, there's no sound, there's no light. All you've got to go on as a brain is a series of noisy and ambiguous sensory signals, electrical signals that are only indirectly related to things in the world, whatever they may be. Now these sensory signals don't come with labels, they don't come with, like, I'm from a coffee cup or I'm from a chair. They don't even come with labels that I'm from the eyes or the ears or the heart. They're just streams of electrical impulses. So the brain, therefore, has to make an interpretation of what's causing these sensory inputs. So the act of perception, from the brain's perspective, has to involve combining some prior knowledge or some prior expectations about what's out there that it then combines with these ambiguous sensory signals to form its best guess of what actually caused those sensory signals. And that's what we perceive. The brain doesn't hear sound or see light. What we perceive is its best guess of what's actually out there. That's the basic idea of the predictive brain. And I want to give you just a couple of more examples of this idea in practice in very simple situations. This is another quite familiar visual illusion called Adolphin's checkerboard. How many people have seen this one before? Still not so many. Okay. So if you look at this image, you'll see there are two squares marked A and B, highlighted in red here. Now, those two squares hopefully should look to you to be different shades of grey. Do they? What are you doing? You're like looking at through one eye or something. Okay, don't try and break the trick. So how many people see this as being two different shades of grey, the A and the B? Okay, so that's most of you, right? Of course, the point of this is they're not different at all. They're in fact exactly the same shade of grey, and I can show you this if I put up another version of the image here, and I've just exactly the same background image, but I've just joined together the two patches A and B with a single coloured bar of grey. And you can see that it's one continuous shade, and if you think I'm still maybe messing around, I'll just move this bar across, and there you can see there's no trickery here. Now they look the same, joined by this bar, but if I take that away, they look different again. Doesn't matter how many times you've seen this, it always works. Which is good because I've seen it I don't know how many times now. And what's going on here is the brain is using its prior knowledge that objects in shadow appear darker than they are. That's knowledge that's been wired into your visual cortex over many, many, many generations. And that's why we see B as lighter than it is, because it's in shadow there. Now this is a simple example of how the brain's prior expectations shape what we perceive. Here's another example which shows just how quickly the brain can use new predictions to change conscious experience. And this is an auditory example. So I want you to have a listen to this sound. Is there a sound? We tried this before. It should work. Let me try again. Okay, can we have a bit more volume? I'm going to play it again. But you heard something, right? Okay, let's try again. Okay, now that was the full version, so it didn't quite work, but you heard that. Now listen to the first version again, and you should have heard it twice, but let's see. Okay, this is not quite working, so let me just go back here and try that one again. So have a listen to this. Problem is you've now heard the full version, but did anybody... So just imagine you haven't heard that full version, and this is just going to sound like a bunch of noisy whistles, right? And you go, yeah, it sounds like nothing. And then you play it again. Still sounds like nothing. And then you hear this. Right. And then you hear this again. And now, wow, you suddenly hear the man read the newspaper at lunchtime. So it helps if they come in the right order, but the idea here is that really the first time you hear it, it does sound like a bit nonsense. And then after you've heard what it really is, you can listen to the same thing again, and it's pretty clear. And what I think is important about this example is that the sensory input that your brain's getting hasn't changed at all. All that changes is your brain's expectations about what caused that, and that changes instantly your conscious experience. And you can't ever undo it, which is why it doesn't work to try it again for a second time. Now, putting things this way changes quite dramatically how we think about perception. It's typical to think about perception as a kind of bottom-up process in which sensory signals enter through the eyes and the ears, and they progress deeper into the brain, bringing increasingly sophisticated processing at every stage. So this is, you can imagine, like early stages of the visual cortex dealing with things like lines and edges and maybe shapes and orientations and contrast, and then higher levels dealing with things like full shapes, and then even higher levels or deeper levels dealing with complex things like faces and people and integrated visual scenes. And this is a monkey visual system, so this is a monkey face at sort of high levels of the visual system. A lot of neuroscientists, vision scientists still think of vision in this way, as a sort of bottom-up or outside-in process. All the perceptual heavy lifting is done by signals flowing from the outside world into the body. Now, this prediction machine view, this best guessing view, changes things around quite dramatically, and it tells us that perception depends just as much, if not more. It depends not only on these sensory signals coming into the brain from the outside world, but just as much, if not more, on perceptual predictions flowing in the opposite direction, from the top down or the inside out, so that this is the sense, the real sense, the kind of neurophysiologically literal sense in which we actively generate our worlds. We don't just passively perceive them. And this is how the brain implements this process of best guessing. And there's a lot more detail here, which I won't go into today, but this is pretty much what my lab in England is focusing on, is how does this actually happen? How does the brain balance these incoming sensory signals with these top-down predictions about their causes to form what we perceive? And the basic idea that we play with is that, and this is in many other labs too, is that it's a process of what we can call Bayesian inference, probabilistic reasoning. So the brain is continually updating its best guess, using sensory information not as a readout of what's there, but always just as an error signal. So perception is this kind of calibration where at every point the brain is just trying to minimize the difference between what it expects and what it gets, given some prediction about what's out there. So we are always in this continual process of just trying to minimize the error between what's out there and what our brain thinks is out there. And that's what perception is. It's a process of continual calibration. And one implication of thinking this way is that what we see in normal life, and not just in these examples of visual illusions, is always not only shaped but built from these perceptual expectations that the brain has. And we all know this in some way. If you walk out of your house on a foggy morning and you're expecting to meet a friend, you'll see that person, and then it's only when you get closer you realize you've been waving at a stranger. Your expectation at seeing the person is so strong that you saw them. They were there. And this is, again, one of the ideas we tried to put on a bit of a firmer footing in the laboratory. I just show you this as one of the kinds of experiments that we do. This was with one of my postdocs, Yaya Pinto, a few years ago now. And what happens here is that this is a technique called continuous flash suppression. And what happens is you have a stereoscope on. In one eye, you see either an image of a house or a face, which appears slowly. The contrast changes from 0 to strong. And in the other eye, there's this randomly changing mixture of colored squares, which starts at a strong contrast and then becomes dimmer. Now, at a certain point, the person sees either the house or the face. It sort of breaks through as the contrast becomes strong enough. And what we do is we lead people to expect that they're going to see either a house or a face, in this case, just by telling them. That's one easy way to do it. And then we ask, how does their expectation influence how easy it is to see the house or the face? And what we find is that when people are expecting to see, let's say, a face, they see it more quickly and more accurately than if they're expecting to see a house. So when sensory data matches our expectations, we see it more quickly and more accurately. So that's in line with the idea that what we perceive is what we expect. And if you like, that's just the data, proper data. The larger message from this is that it's not so much that I'll believe something when I see it, but more that I will see something when I believe it. And these beliefs can be all sorts. They can be very low-level beliefs that you cannot change, like the belief that things in shadows appear darker. But they can be very high-level beliefs too. They can be beliefs shaped by your development, by your environment, by your social context, by your culture. There's a whole raft of experiments looking at how beliefs based on cultural and racial stereotypes can, for example, alter how likely people are to perceive an object someone is holding in their hand as being a gun or being a hand tool. You can imagine how relevant that is in society today. So this idea of predictive perception also helps us understand what happens in unusual situations where some people experience things that other people don't. What we typically call a hallucination. This is typically thought of as a false perception. And the basic idea is that hallucinations happen when perceptual predictions are so strong that they overwhelm the sensory data, so the brain comes to an unusual best guess. We see what we expect more than we normally do. And again, there's a continuity here. It's not just we have hallucinations and the rest of the stuff is normal. We see faces everywhere. The brain is so tuned to detecting faces that we will see faces in clouds. We can see faces even in architecture. And there's a brilliant Twitter feed that just shows faces in all sorts of weird places. This is an intuitive example of a general phenomenon which we call in neuroscience pareidolia, which is the tendency to see patterns in things. And this is what brains generally do. But what does it mean to see a pattern? What it means to see a pattern is the brain is imposing what it thinks is a very important or reliable prediction on a patternless array of sensory data. And we've been taking this idea a bit further in the lab at Sussex, using a combination of machine learning and virtual reality to build what we like to call a hallucination machine. Now, this is just a schematic of a typical thing in AI called a deep neural network. These networks are very common now. They're very good at classifying images. You can show a photo to an image like this, and what it does is it sort of processes it in this bottom-up direction, trained to recognize what objects are in this image. This particular network is very good at telling whether a dog is in an image, and if so, what kind of dog. It's extremely useful at that you see these algorithms pretty much everywhere. It's called a neural network. It's loosely based on how the visual system works. And what we did was we wanted to run it backwards. So we thought, and actually Google had done this before in a more limited way, but we thought, okay, we can tell the network that a dog is there and then update the image rather than update the network's best guess. So we're imposing the prediction of dog into an image. And that's what we've done here. This is Sussex campus where I work on a Tuesday lunchtime. And what we've done here is we've taken some panoramic video and we've processed every frame of this video through this algorithm so that we're imposing on the image the expectation that dog, basically that. The network is just thinking dog. So everything in the image is being processed as if there's an expectation of dog there. And you can see this leads to some very strange effects. There are a few too many dogs here. It doesn't really look like this. But what I find fascinating is that it's not just we photoshopped images of dogs onto a video. The dogs are really coming out at all levels. And the phenomenology of this, especially if you do experience it through a virtual reality headset and you can look around, is really quite immersive and striking. And it's quite reminiscent of some other kinds of altered perception, maybe psychedelic hallucination, maybe even some aspects of psychosis. So there's a serious thing here, which is by doing this kind of technique, we can really get a detailed handle on how the brain is generating altered states of awareness, and therefore also how it's working right now in the here and now. And if you think about this just a little bit more, if hallucination is a kind of uncontrolled perception, then normal perception here and now is also, what was that? Was that a 5-minute card? 10-minute card, thank you. Then normal perception in the here and now is also a kind of hallucination, but it's a controlled hallucination in which the brain's predictions are continually being reined in by sensory signals coming from the world. And in fact, you could say that we're all hallucinating all the time. It's just that when we agree about our hallucinations, that's what we call the real world. There's just one connection I want to make from one of my inspirations, Francisco Varela, who was one of the leaders of bringing together the connection between mindfulness meditation and neuroscience. Fortunately, he died quite young. I never got to meet him. But what he said in one of his 1970 papers was, what we essentially share is our capacity for constructing a reality. I think that's one of the things that we humans do, probably all creatures. And in the last 10 minutes, I want to move on and basically tell you that the same story applies to the experience of being a self, to the experience of being you or being me. And this might sound a bit strange, maybe not to this audience, but it's quite normal to take the experience of selfhood for granted. But there are, in fact, many different ways we experience being a self. Why is it gone? It's gone. Never mind. Oh, no. There's the bodily self, the experience of being and having a body. That's one aspect of self. There's the experience of perceiving the world from a particular point of view. There's the experience of intending to do things, what we sometimes call free will. Then there's the experience of being a continuous person over time with a set of memories and an identity. And finally, there's the aspects of being a self that's refracted through the minds of others, that I experience being me partly in how I perceive others perceiving me. All of these aspects of self can come apart in different ways, and this happens in various psychiatric and neurological conditions, we notice. So being a self is not just one thing, it's not the essence of you, it's many different forms of perception that loosely hang together in the here and now. And I want to focus just on one aspect of the self, which is the bodily self, the experience of identifying with a particular object in the world, which is me, which is my body. And the idea is that this too is a perceptual best guess in which the brain is combining prior expectations about what is and what it's not its body with sensory data. How many people know about the rubber hand illusion? Not so many. Good. It's more fun. This is a lovely demonstration of this in practice. This is called the rubber hand illusion. And in the rubber hand illusion, you can try this at home. It's quite easy. All you need is, well, if you happen to have a fake hand at home, you can try it at home. Several. You take a volunteer and you make sure they can't see their real hand. It's hidden behind a partition. And you put the fake hand in front of them in roughly the position where the real hand would be. And then you, the experimenter, you take 2 paintbrushes and you stroke both the real hand and the fake hand synchronously while your volunteer, your guinea pig, is staring at the fake hand. And what happens for most people most of the time is that after a while, they start to have the uncanny feeling that the fake hand is in fact part of their body. And the idea is the brain, it knows it's a fake hand in some ways, but it's seeing touch on an object that looks like a hand and is roughly where a hand should be. And that's enough evidence for it to reach an unusual best guess that, okay, that fake hand is in fact part of my body. And there are a number of ways to test it. But that's the best.
What about?
And if you do that properly, you can really measure clever things like skin conductance and so on, and you can really see that something is going on. And if you stroke them out of time asynchronously, it works. It doesn't work. So there's something going on. We've actually, last year, we decided to do the world's largest rubber hand study because there are quite a lot of interesting individual differences in the strength of this effect. And so one of my colleagues, Peter Lush, he actually spent a week with a nail file just making the fake hands less shiny, which was one of the more bizarre things that scientists end up doing. But we had 5 fake hands, and we tested 400 people on this illusion, and we also measured their hypnotic suggestibility. Now, hypnosis gets a bit of a bad rap in neuroscience and psychology as well, but it's a real phenomenon. People vary in the extent to which that through suggestion they can be induced to have particular experiences, and we find that this explains quite a lot about this effect. Too. But that's just another way of saying it depends on the balance between prior and sensory data. You can even extend this to the whole body. So what we've done here is we've given people VR headsets, 2 people, they have cameras on, and then we swap the feed so that one person sees the input from the other headset. Then they face each other, so one person is seeing themselves from the other person's perspective. And then if you get them to shake hands, and that provides this critical multisensory congruence, then you get this weird experience that you're now shaking hands with yourself from somebody else's first-person perspective. You body swapped. So that's kind of, it's not just your arm, it's now your whole body. And then this is very interesting. In fact, the UN have started being interested in this technology as a sort of empathy generation machine. So you could, for instance, body swap with somebody from a different culture, from a different economic background, from a different just situation. My friend and colleague Danish Masood has been looking at body swapping or giving people the experience of being in the body of a family where children have been lost through gun violence in Mexico. And that it gives you a sort of first-person empathy generation device here, which I think has, it's got power, it's also got some ethical issues too, but you can push it in that direction. And just the other, I think, inference from this is that throughout millennia, people have been talking about things like out-of-body experiences. That, okay, I've left my body and I've gone floating around, and therefore my essence of me, my soul, must be separable from the messy flesh and blood of my brain and my body, because I've had this experience of floating around. And then scientists would say, what rubbish, that can't happen. I think the important thing is both things are correct, right? People have these experiences, out-of-body experiences. They can happen in all sorts of contexts, in intense spiritual episodes, in operating theatres quite frequently, in moments of extreme trauma. People have the experience that they're not in their body. This does not, however, mean that their soul has actually left their body. How things seem is not how they are. What it means is their brain has reached a different best guess, for whatever reason, about where its first-person perspective is located. And it can be located outside the body. So here's this what it seems like picture again, with the world producing sensations that are read out by the self to form perceptions of this world. That's how things seem. Now, how things are, I think, is rather different. It's not the self that does the perceiving. The self itself is a perception. Another convenient fiction generated by the brain. And I want to finish just by taking you one step further to this idea that there's more to self than just having a body. There's also this experience of being a body, this very hard to describe, inchoate experience of simply being a living organism, the feeling of being alive, you might say. I think this is something that mindfulness can get you to sometimes. And this brings us to another kind of sensation perception, which is called interoception. This is often quite overlooked in neuroscience, but a large amount of neuronal real estate is actually dedicated to sensing and controlling and perceiving sensory signals coming from within the body. These are things that report things like blood pressure, how the heart is doing, gastric distension, all sorts of important things from the perspective of staying alive. And the brain fundamentally needs to know what's happening in the body so it can control it. And this actually brings up a point about what brains are for. Now, brains are not for rationality, happiness, or accurate perception, or solving complex crossword problems, or whatever. Brains evolved in part to efficiently ensure that an animal can grow, survive, and reproduce. Brains are fundamentally, evolutionarily, developmentally, and in the here and now, for staying alive. That's the most important thing a brain can do. And this has a number of implications. One is that emotions are also perceptions. But in this case, emotions are perceptions of what's going on inside the body. Just as signals from the outside world don't come with labels like this is vision and this is sound, signals from inside the body don't either. It's the same process. The brain has to make its best guess about what causes sensory signals from inside the body. It's a process of best guessing of inference in just the same way. And what happens when the brain does this is we perceive, well, I think anyway, we experience an emotion. There's actually an old tradition that says this from William James and Carl Langer back in the 19th century, that emotions are perceptions of changes in body state. When we see a bear and feel fear, it's not that the sight of the bear causes fear and then we run away. It's the sight of the bear causes all kinds of physiological changes in our body, and it's perception of those changes happening that is the experience, the emotion of fear. And I think, again, this has very interesting connections with mindfulness about understanding through better tuning our senses to the body to understand our emotional lives. And we all know that we feel emotions in different places on the body. This is just a map of where people would locate feelings on their body for all sorts of different emotions. But there's something kind of interesting about emotions, which is that a glass to me has a three-dimensional existence. It's an object with a back and sides and a shape and a position. Emotions aren't like that. Emotions don't have shapes. Metaphorically they do, but really they don't. I mean, they don't in the same way that real objects do. Sadness doesn't have sides. Why is this? Well, I think it's because perception, when it comes to the body, isn't about figuring out what's out there. It's about controlling and regulating it. My brain doesn't care where my kidneys are. It just cares that they're working properly. Whereas for things in the world, I need to know where they are and what they are. And so this means that when the brain is using predictions to figure out what's out there, we have a particular kind of experience. We experience things as being objects, as having a sort of spatial extent and organization. But when the brain is using predictions to control and regulate the body, we experience how well that control is going. We experience things like emotion and mood. So we can understand a different character of experience through this lens of the predictive brain. And it also means that there's a very, very strong connection between being alive and all of our experiences. Now, Descartes, back in the 17th century, said, among other things, that being alive has really nothing to do with being conscious, having a mind. We are just beast machines, and our rational cognitive minds are what set us apart from other animals. Now, I think completely the opposite is true, that we are conscious, we have minds, we have experiences, not in spite of, but because of our nature as living creatures. Because all the mechanisms that underlie all our perceptions, whether they are of the world around us or of the body, they all derive from this basic fundamental imperative to stay alive. The brain evolved perception primarily as a means of regulating the body, and those mechanisms later became useful for perceiving the world. And the lesson here is that we experience the world and the self with, through, and because of our living bodies. So let me bring things together and stop. How things seem is not how they are. We started with vision. Our vivid experience of an external world is not a direct window onto an external reality. It's the result of the brain's efforts to continually predict its incoming sensory flow. This also applies to the self. The self is not the thing that does the perceiving, something that lurks behind the eyes looking out. The self itself is a perception. And then the perception of the self has more to do with control and regulation than with figuring out what's out there, which is why the experience of being a self has the character that it has. But altogether, our experiences of the world around us and ourselves within it are controlled hallucinations designed by evolution to keep us alive in worlds that are full of unpredictable danger and opportunity. So 3 quick implications of this, and then I'm done. The first is that perception is very closely linked to imagination. Since perception depends on the ability to make best guesses about what's out there, these best guesses, when they free run, that's what we call imagination. We cannot perceive things that we cannot imagine. The second thing is, just as we can misperceive the world, we can also misperceive ourselves. And when the mechanisms of perceptual prediction of the body go wrong, I think that underlies a lot of mental and psychiatric disorders. Their misperceptions, miscontrol of bodily states. There's a whole branch of psychiatry now called computational psychosomatics, which we try to understand the specific symptoms of various conditions like anxiety, depersonalization, in terms of mispredicting of the body. And this is important because in psychiatry, at the moment, in medicine anyway, we tend to just treat the symptoms. We don't really get down to the mechanisms. And we have things like painkillers, but not antibiotics in psychiatry, and we need to do better than that, as Mo pointed out at the very beginning. And finally, is this blue and black, or is it white and gold? Blue and black? A few of you? White and gold? Not so many? Neither, or both, or different? Nobody. I mean, so the point of this is to get us back to, because our perception depends on prediction, we all have different brains, we all will make slightly different predictions, we all inhabit different perceptual realities, we all have our own individual, unique inner universes. And I think this example of the dress, it is actually blue and black. So well done, those people. No, I mean, not just I think it is blue and black. Shows that we do inhabit different perceptual realities, and we will also overestimate the degree to which we experience the same. Unless I specifically ask that question, you go around assuming you had exactly the same experience of everybody else of that dress, but you've had 2 quite distinct experiences. This is important because I think we need to overestimate our perceptual uniformity in order to communicate, to say, yeah, there's a dress. But we also need to recognize that our experiences might be more different than we tend to assume. And that opens again a space for better understanding, better communication. And if you're interested, I wrote about this in the Scientific American earlier this summer. So, conclusion, how things seem. Perception happens from the outside in. The self is that which does the perceiving. The body is just some kind of transportation for the mind. And we inhabit a common perceptual reality. How things are, perception happens from the inside out. The self is a perception. We perceive the world and the self with, through, and because of our living bodies. And we inhabit different perceptual realities. So I want to close, I want to thank the people in my lab who've done a lot of the experimental work behind that. There's a new book, if you're interested. I haven't written it yet, but, well, I have written it. I had to edit it. It should be out next summer, called Being You. You can sign up for updates there. And there's all sorts of other things you can follow up with as well. So thank you very much for your attention.